In the dim glow of an early autumn evening, Officer Bradley Daniels stood outside the small-town police station, breathing in the crisp air that hinted at turning leaves in the hush of twilight. He'd been patrolling the winding streets of Willowbend for over a decade, ever since the day he'd returned from his military deployment overseas. Quiet towns had their share of secrets, but Willowbend was especially known for its peculiar undercurrents of hush-hush family feuds, sudden disappearances, and rumors of hidden tunnels beneath old properties. Sometimes Bradley felt these stories were merely folklore, but he could never quite shake the unsettling feeling that something very real lurked behind those whispered legends. He tugged at the collar of his uniform, scanning the horizon for any sign of unusual activity. A strange restlessness had settled in his gut that evening, a sense of foreboding that warned him something might happen soon. A soft, plaintive whimper carried on the breeze, faint enough that Bradley almost dismissed it as the distant cry of a nocturnal animal. But then it came again, more clearly, like a puppy crying. Ears pricking with concern, he stepped away from the station's stoop and headed toward the source of the sound. The lampposts along the sidewalk cast long, flickering shadows across the pavement, and as he followed the whimper, it grew louder. It was definitely a puppy, and it was clearly in distress. Bradley's heartbeat quickened. In a town like Willowbend, an abandoned puppy might be the least of the department's concerns, but something about the desperation in those cries made him pick up his pace. He turned the corner onto a narrower side street, the kind usually frequented by old folks on their morning walks or local kids riding bikes. At that late hour it was empty, and most of the modest houses had their lights turned down low. The crying grew so loud that Bradley found himself moving almost instinctively, each step punctuated by the haunting echoes of a tiny bark. A few yards ahead, beneath the flicker of a broken street lamp, he finally spotted the trembling outline of a small golden-furred puppy. It looked drenched, as if it had just run through puddles or perhaps gotten caught in the drizzle earlier. Its large eyes reflected fear and desperation, and as soon as it saw Bradley's figure, it let out another forlorn yelp. A wave of protective instinct shot through him. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the fact that the puppy seemed too small to be roaming outside alone, or maybe because there was a collar around its neck, indicating someone was supposed to be taking care of it. Officer Daniels crouched low, extending a cautious hand. The puppy sniffled, cowering, then timidly padded forward until it touched its cold nose to his fingertips. Bradley felt the slight tremor running through the tiny body. He gently stroked the puppy's fur, noticing the mud and the faint lines of dried blood near its paws, as though it had run a long distance over rough terrain. He murmured soothingly, "It's all right, buddy, I've got you now." Then he glanced at the collar. A small, inconspicuous band of leather hung around the puppy's neck, the edges scuffed and worn, suggesting it had probably been put on a while ago. But what truly froze him in place was the symbol etched into the leather, a stylized emblem that appeared to be some sort of crest. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had seen that symbol before in old case files stored in the musty back room of the station. The emblem was linked to an unsolved case from years ago, something that had involved a local family with a rumored involvement in everything from questionable real estate to black market dealings. His fingertips brushed over the engraved lines and goosebumps spread across his arms. This was more than just an abandoned puppy. The collar represented a past that Willowbend didn't like to talk about, a skeleton in the town's closet that no one dared bring into the light. For a moment, Bradley hesitated. The puppy stared up at him with watery eyes, as if begging for help or perhaps pointing him toward a path he could not yet see. He recalled rummaging through dusty manila folders years back, folders that contained half-baked details on suspicious fires, missing pets, runaways, and in one instance, the disappearance of a local nurse who was rumored to have stumbled upon something she shouldn't have. The symbol on the puppy's collar connected to the Armitage family, although how he wasn't entirely certain. The Armitage estate had been cordoned off after a disastrous fire some years ago, but talk in the diner or around the barbershop always hinted that the tragedy wasn't as straightforward as it appeared. Some swore the family fled town after the incident, others believed they'd been taken by a dangerous group. Now, seeing that emblem again was like stepping into a time warp. He lifted the puppy gingerly and carried it to his cruiser parked nearby. Wrapping it in a small blanket he kept in the trunk, he made a quick decision to drive over to the Armitage property, an old Victorian manor on the far edge of town. He wasn't entirely sure what he expected to find, maybe nothing. Maybe the remains of an abandoned building ravaged by time and weather, or maybe something that would finally give him a clue as to why that emblem was marked on a puppy's collar. The very idea felt surreal. He strapped the puppy gently in the passenger seat, its trembling subsiding a bit as soon as it realized it was no longer alone. Rain started to drizzle again, the gentle tapping on the cruiser's windshield growing more insistent by the minute. Headlights cut through the early night as he navigated the lonely roads. Willowbend's outskirts were thick with old oak trees, their canopies forming a near tunnel in places. For a fleeting moment, Bradley thought he saw shadows darting among the trees. He blinked, focusing on the road, but that eerie sensation of being watched refused to let go of his nerves. The radio on his dashboard crackled softly, giving him static-laced updates about another officer responding to a minor traffic accident near Main Street, nothing out of the ordinary. He wondered if he should radio in about his own odd discovery, a puppy with a collar that might connect to a long-dead case, but something told him to hold off. If he was right about the significance of that symbol, he needed to be cautious. There were those in Willowbend who might not be thrilled to see old histories dug up again. The Armitage estate was situated at the end of a winding gravel path, lined by wrought iron lampposts that hadn't lit up in years. Weeds and tall grass bent under the weight of the falling rain. The once grand front gates, twisted with ornate metalwork, stood rusted and ajar. Bradley brought his cruiser to a slow stop, the beams of his headlights revealing the skeletal outline of the ruined mansion beyond. He let out a slow breath. Even from a distance, he could see the sagging roof, the broken windows, and the rotted porch. It was a wonder the structure was still standing at all. The puppy whimpered again, startling him. He unwrapped the blanket slightly to check on it. Those wide brown eyes seemed to plead with him, almost as though urging him forward into the gloom. Wading through the unruly grass, Bradley approached the manor. Each step felt heavier than the last, his boots squelching in the mud. The front door was missing, torn off its hinges by time or perhaps by trespassers. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and damp ash, a grim reminder of the fire that had ravaged it. His flashlight cut through thick dust motes dancing in the damp air, revealing a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase that had partially collapsed. Dark scorch marks climbed the walls, forming ominous shapes in the flickering beam. Most of the banisters had rotted away, leaving jagged splinters where an elegant rail once stood. An eerie quiet reigned, broken only by the distant drip of water leaking through the broken roof. He paused beneath the remains of a chandelier, a shattered masterpiece of crystal that lay in jagged shards across the floor. The puppy in his arms seemed to tense, a soft growl forming in its throat. Bradley tried to soothe it, though he felt his own pulse quicken. Something about the place exuded an aura of dread, as if the shadows themselves were alive and watching. He noticed a few footprints in the dust, unmistakably human, leading toward the back of the foyer, fresh footprints, not from long ago. Slowly, he moved deeper into the ruins, following the footprints into what must have once been a lavish parlor. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls and soggy furniture lay toppled. In one corner, surprisingly untouched by the devastation, stood an ornate bookshelf, its glass doors eerily intact. Curiosity gnawed at him. The footprints disappeared as if whoever had made them had taken pains to conceal further tracks. The puppy's growling stopped, replaced by an anxious whimper as though it could sense something beyond the edges of human perception. Bradley took a moment, scanning the walls, the ceiling, everything. His breath caught when his flashlight revealed a single distinct symbol drawn in ash or charcoal on the fireplace's brickwork, the same emblem as on the puppy's collar. His mind raced. Why was this symbol everywhere? What did it stand for exactly? He had read theories in those old case files that it belonged to a clandestine society the Armitage family was rumored to be involved with. Some locals suspected the family was part of an illicit organization operating behind the veneer of philanthropy and business dealings. Others whispered that the Armitages dabbled in the occult, though he had never seen evidence of that. Bradley's rational side dismissed the more fantastic claims, but he couldn't deny that the presence of that symbol here was no coincidence. He wondered if the rumors of secret rooms or hidden passages were true. The mansion was old enough that a labyrinth of corridors or concealed compartments might indeed exist. As the drizzle outside turned into a steady rain, the officer strained to hear anything else, a creaking floorboard, a muffled voice, the distant scurrying of rats. But aside from the patter of rain, the place was silent. The puppy squirmed in his arms, apparently eager to explore. Carefully, he set it down on the dusty floor, still keeping a firm hand near the collar to prevent it from darting off into some hidden danger. The puppy sniffed the ground, whimpering occasionally, and then began tugging at Bradley's pant leg as if to guide him. With a wary glance at the half-collapsed ceiling, he decided to follow the puppy's lead. They traversed a debris-strewn hallway, stepping over broken beams and plaster chunks. The corridor led them to a narrower space at the back of the mansion, a small door that seemed out of place, half-rotted and slightly ajar. The puppy insisted on pushing forward, so he nudged the door open and found himself facing a steep set of stairs descending into a basement or possibly a cellar. The air that wafted up was thick with damp earth and stale air, carrying with it a hint of something else, an acrid chemical odor that made his eyes water momentarily. Another chill ran down his spine. A hidden basement, or at least a mostly hidden one. This could be where the footprints had disappeared. He guided the flashlight beam down the steps, revealing bare stone walls that glistened with moisture. The puppy hesitated only for a second before starting to descend, so Bradley followed. His heart pounded with each creaking step, expecting at any moment for the boards to give way or for someone to leap out of the darkness. But no one did. Instead, they reached the bottom, where the cramped space opened up into a larger chamber. The circle of light illuminated crude shelving along the walls, stacked with unidentifiable bottles, metal tools, and tattered notebooks. The faint odor of chemicals was stronger here. On the far side, a metal table had been overturned, scattering glass vials that had presumably once contained various substances. Some labels were in a language he didn't recognize. It felt like stepping into a clandestine laboratory or workshop that had been abruptly abandoned. Bradley found his mind spinning with questions. Why would the Armitages have such a place beneath their home? The official reports talked about a tragic fire caused by faulty wiring, not a hidden space for questionable experiments. The puppy abruptly pawed at a small trunk near the shelving, letting out a high-pitched bark. With some effort, Bradley pried it open. Inside were stacks of documents, many bearing that same haunting symbol. He flipped through them rapidly, unable to decipher much at a glance. Some pages showed diagrams of odd sigils, some had references to property deeds and land transfers. One page contained a list of names, many of which he didn't recognize, but his blood ran cold when he spotted the last name, Nurse Charlene Baines, the same woman who had gone missing nearly a decade ago. Then below that, a note in scribbled handwriting read, "She knows too much." Before he could process the significance of these papers, the puppy began barking more urgently, the noise echoing off the stone walls. Bradley turned sharply, shining his flashlight around. One corner of the basement was cordoned off by a large makeshift partition, possibly constructed from old boards hammered together. Something about it unsettled him. It was too deliberate, as if someone had sealed off a section of the cellar. He approached warily, his grip on the flashlight turning his knuckles white. The puppy barked again, but this time it cowered behind him, ears flattened. A rancid smell emanated from somewhere behind the partition, sending Bradley's stomach roiling. He found a narrow gap where two boards didn't quite meet and used his flashlight to peer through. The beam revealed a partial view of a cramped enclosure littered with bedding, empty food cans, and most disturbingly dark stains on the floor that looked ominously like old blood. Dread pressed in on him. Was this a holding cell, a place where someone or something had been kept? The swirling questions and the sense of inescapable danger felt suffocating. He backed away, heart pounding, the puppy trembling at his feet. A strong impulse told him to get out of there and call for backup. But even as he considered it, he felt the unshakable notion that if he left now, crucial evidence or a chance to uncover the truth might vanish for good. The storm outside was intensifying, thunder rumbling in the distance, as if nature itself was warning him that time was running short. He moved to examine the rest of the chamber, stepping gingerly around the scattered vials on the floor. One in particular caught his eye, its label reading hexatrin B, which he recognized from police bulletins about black market drugs rumored to be tested on animals. A wave of sorrow washed over him at the thought of the little puppy being subjected to such horrors. Was that why this poor creature bore the symbol on its collar? Perhaps it was meant as some kind of lab subject or experiment. The puppy whined again, nudging the scattered notes with its nose, as if urging him to uncover more. Bradley's attention settled on a locked cabinet near the far wall, the metal door scratched and partially corroded. He found a crowbar among the tools on one shelf and went to work on the lock, sweat beading on his brow from the effort. After several grueling minutes, the cabinet finally gave way with a shriek of metal. Inside were more documents, meticulously organized into folders. He leafed through them, heart hammering as he recognized references to multiple individuals in Willowbend. Some were local business owners, others were ordinary citizens. There was mention of blackmail, coded references to shipments, and ominous hints about controlling the local water supply. This was far bigger than just the Armitage family. It looked like a full-blown conspiracy, with tendrils reaching into multiple facets of the town. One file contained pictures, grainy black and white images of men in suits shaking hands in discreet meetings. The puppy whimpered at his feet, almost as if sensing the gravity of what he held. These men in the photographs were some of Willowbend's most influential figures. A date scrawled on the back of one picture was from 8 years ago, the same year Nurse Baines vanished. Another image showed what appeared to be an estate sale involving crates. The symbol on the crates matched the one on the puppy's collar. Bradley felt a swirl of anger and revulsion in his chest. Had Willowbend's upper crust been importing something illicit and dangerous? And why would they brand a poor animal with that same logo? A heavy thud echoed from upstairs, nearly stopping his heart. He froze, flashlight aimed at the narrow staircase that led back to the foyer. Thunder crashed again, casting strange vibrations through the rotting beams. Slowly he extinguished his flashlight to minimize detection, though the near-total darkness made his breath ragged. The puppy pressed close to his leg, trembling. Another faint sound, this time like muted footsteps, drifted down from above. Someone else was here. He listened carefully, training all his senses on that faint noise. It paused, then resumed, as though the intruder was moving carefully, mindful of the old wooden floors. Bradley's thoughts raced. Should he announce himself as a police officer, or remain hidden and see what the stranger was up to? The basement offered him limited escape routes, and if the person upstairs came down, he'd be cornered. Yet the last thing he wanted was to get into a confrontation in a labyrinth of rotting boards with uncertain structural integrity. Clutching the puppy gently, he stepped toward the far side of the room, searching for any other way out. Dark shapes loomed in the blackness. The thunder rumbled overhead again, and the patter of footsteps drew closer to the top of the stairs. A sudden flare of a flashlight pierced the crack under the door. In that brief glow, he could see a silhouette on the other side, a shape that paused as if listening. Adrenaline coursed through Bradley's veins. The puppy let out a soft whine, and he quickly placed a reassuring hand over its back, hoping the stranger hadn't heard. Then the footsteps retreated and the faint light vanished. He waited, heart pounding, counting the seconds as if each tick might determine life or death. The footsteps faded, but he wasn't convinced the threat was gone. He knew he needed to leave, but the question remained, should he take the documents? They might be the key to cracking open a cold case and exposing a powerful conspiracy. Yet carrying them out would slow him down and risk making noise. Caught between options, he made a split decision. Gathering the most incriminating-looking files and stuffing them into a plastic bag he found lying among the clutter, he positioned the puppy under one arm. Then carefully, he clicked his flashlight back on, the narrow beam guiding him as he hurried to the stairs. Every creak of the old boards felt magnified tenfold as he climbed up. He paused at the top, pressing an ear to the door. Silence. The hallway beyond was still. Gingerly, he pushed the door open. The corridor lay before him, as dark and desolate as before. The only difference now was that a gust of cold, damp air blew in through the foyer, telling him the front of the mansion was open to the elements more than it had been when he arrived. He peered into the parlor, searching for any sign of the intruder. Nothing. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the broken windows. Thunder followed almost immediately, shaking the walls. A primal instinct told him he should sprint for the exit. He took a slow step forward, eyes scanning every corner, the puppy tense against him. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw a faint movement near the collapsed staircase. He stopped short, flicking the flashlight beam in that direction. A figure stood there, half hidden by a fractured banister. Despite the gloom, Bradley could tell the stranger was tall, wearing what looked like a hooded coat, the face obscured by shadow. They were perfectly still, observing him with a predatory calm that sent a jolt of terror through his core. In a steady voice that belied his racing heart, Bradley called out, "Police, stay where you are." The figure remained silent, unmoving. Rain pounded on the roof, water dripping through cracks in the ceiling. Bradley repeated himself, trying to project confidence. "You're trespassing on condemned property. I have reason to suspect illegal activity here." Again, no response, just that unnerving silence. Then, in a burst of movement that caught him off guard, the figure sprinted toward a side exit. The puppy barked and Bradley gave chase, weaving around debris. But by the time he reached the side hall, the stranger had vanished into the stormy night. He stood there panting, the cold rain slicing through the shattered walls as if nature were invading the mansion. A sense of dread and frustration sank in. Clearly, someone else knew about the mansion's secrets. And if that person was connected to the dark undertakings implied by the basement stash of files, Bradley had just become a serious threat to them. The puppy whined, and he took that as a cue. He needed to get out before something worse happened. Struggling through the muddy yard, documents tucked safely under his jacket, he reached his cruiser and set the puppy gently inside. The wind howled around them, whipping branches from nearby trees. He placed the bag of files on the passenger seat and turned the key in the ignition, half expecting the engine to fail at the worst possible moment. But the cruiser roared to life, and he breathed a shaky sigh of relief. Pulling away from the Armitage estate, headlights sweeping across the decaying facade, he couldn't help feeling that he was being watched. Whatever was going on in Willowbend, this was only the tip of the iceberg. He sped back into the center of town, adrenaline still coursing through him. The puppy lay curled in the passenger seat, exhausted. Occasionally it gazed up at Bradley with an expression that seemed almost human in its worry. He reached over and gently scratched behind its ears, murmuring, "We'll figure this out, I promise." In the distance, the streetlights flickered and a few late-night diners still glowed along Main Street, oblivious to the storms, both literal and figurative, brewing in the outskirts. Bradley parked behind the station, not wanting to draw attention by coming in the front. He carried the puppy and the bag of documents through a side entrance and up to his small office in the back. The station was mostly empty now, aside from the skeleton crew that monitored the radios. He hoped no one would ask too many questions. Locking the door behind him, he spread the papers across his desk, scanning them under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The puppy hopped onto a chair as if curious about the significance of the text and photos. Some pages contained references to Project Willow, Phase 2, and other cryptic terms that gave him chills. A map of the town with certain properties circled suggested that the Armitage mansion was just one of several focal points. Another reference caught his eye, a line reading, "Subject 19 condition, promising." He felt a lump in his throat. Could the puppy be one of these so-called subjects? What were they planning to do with it? And if so, were there others, animals or people, still out there at the mercy of these shadowy schemers? The deeper he dug, the more questions arose. Nurse Baines's name appeared several times, often alongside cryptic notes mentioning medical knowledge and potential liability. It was as if she had discovered too much and had to be silenced. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him, anger, fear, determination. He glanced at the puppy's collar again, tracing the symbol with his thumb. Something dark, organized, and insidious was at play here. If the rumors about the Armitage family's connections to secret societies and corrupt officials were true, then exposing the truth might put a target on his back. At the same time, letting it go wasn't an option. The puppy's mournful gaze was proof enough that innocent lives were at stake. Clutching a handful of documents, Bradley resolved to seek out the old records from the station's archives, cross-referencing every mention of the Armitages, Nurse Baines, and that symbol. He had to see how deep this web truly ran. Before he could begin, a sharp knock on his office door startled him. He froze, glancing at the clock well past midnight. He stepped closer, hushed the puppy, and asked, "Who is it?" Silence at first, then a soft reply from one of the dispatchers. "Officer Daniels, you okay in there? I thought I heard movement." He let out the breath he'd been holding, cracked the door open. It was just Roy, a rookie looking concerned. "Yeah, I'm fine," Bradley replied, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just finishing up some paperwork. Everything's under control." Roy nodded, but his eyes drifted to the puppy huddled near the desk. Bradley quickly stepped into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him before Roy could see the spread of suspicious documents. "You found a puppy?" Roy asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. "Yeah," Bradley said, improvising. "Stray, I'll handle it, don't worry." Roy shrugged and returned to his post. Bradley quickly went back into his office, locking the door. He realized he'd have to keep this investigation quiet, at least until he knew who in the department he could trust. The station had never felt so alien before. Suddenly, it seemed like danger could be lurking in every corner. Everyone could be a suspect, and the knowledge he now possessed made him feel more isolated than ever. The puppy nuzzled at his leg and he hoisted it onto his lap. Gently, he removed the collar to inspect its interior. There were faint etchings on the inside, almost like numbers or coded letters, but too worn to read clearly. He reached for a magnifying glass, heart pounding with anticipation. However, a wave of fatigue caught up with him. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the evening started to wane, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. He realized he couldn't solve this in one night. With a sigh, he set the collar and documents aside, then found a spare towel and old blanket to make a makeshift bed for the puppy. Tomorrow, he would continue digging. For now, he just had to stay alert and keep the evidence hidden. But as he closed his eyes in the darkened office, the images of that basement, the robed figure, and the cryptic pages whirled through his mind. Sleep came fitfully. Each time he drifted off, he saw flickers of the Armitage mansion consumed by flames, hooded shapes chanting in hidden rooms, or Nurse Baines desperately trying to escape an unseen pursuer. The puppy's soft whimpers in the night reminded him that he was no longer just a bystander. He was in the thick of something far larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Somewhere out there in the shadows of Willowbend, others were watching, planning their next move. And that strange symbol burned into his memory now seemed to pulse with malevolent life. By the time dawn's first light peeked through the blinds, Bradley jerked awake, heart pounding. The puppy stirred at his feet. He looked at the clock. He'd slept for maybe an hour. The station would soon be bustling, and he needed to secure those documents someplace safe. Gathering them quickly, he wrapped them in a sturdy envelope. As for the puppy, he hoped to take it to the local vet for a checkup, maybe glean some medical clues about what had been done to it. But not before he took another look at the station's archives to see if anything else might connect the Armitages to the symbol or the cryptic references in those files. He had a long road ahead, and in his gut he sensed that the storm he'd witnessed last night was merely the opening salvo. The real tempest was just beginning, and Willowbend, along with everyone he cared about, could very well be caught in its path. The puppy gazed up at him trustingly, and he whispered, "I'm not giving up." In response, the little creature licked his hand as if to say it understood. He took a moment to collect himself, checking his reflection in a dusty office mirror. Dark circles underscored his eyes. He had only the faintest idea of the magnitude of what he was up against, but a surge of resolve kindled in him. Armed with the truth he'd begun to uncover, he wasn't about to let those hidden forces operate unchallenged anymore. What he didn't know was how dangerous his foes were, how far their influence might reach, or whether the entire department could be compromised. All he knew was that an innocent puppy had led him to a conspiracy that had its claws in Willowbend for longer than anyone realized. And so, as the town began its morning routine, shops opening, school buses picking up kids, the local diner filling with the usual crowd, Officer Bradley Daniels steeled himself for a confrontation with the unseen powers that lurked beneath Willowbend's quaint exterior. In his hands, he held the first real evidence of something monstrous. In the corner of his office, the puppy rested, safe for the moment. Outside, beyond the thin walls of the station, the quiet streets glowed in the morning sun, giving no indication of the secrets hidden in the shadows. But Bradley knew the truth was out there, waiting, and he had only just begun to unearth it. Morning sun spread pale light across the cramped office, outlining the stack of incriminating files on Officer Bradley Daniels' desk. The little puppy lay dozing atop a folded towel, exhausted from the previous night's ordeal. Bradley had dozed only fitfully, jolting awake every so often with images of the Armitage mansion's half-collapsed floors and the robed figure who had vanished into the darkness. Now, with morning trickling in, he sipped on bitter station coffee and steeled himself for the day ahead. He had a disturbing cache of documents implicating some of Willowbend's most influential citizens in God knows what conspiracy, and he wasn't entirely sure who he could trust. His first move was to head to the archives before the station became fully staffed. Cradling the sleeping puppy gently in one arm, he pocketed the envelope of documents and slipped down a side corridor. The Willowbend police archives, two musty rooms stacked with metal cabinets, were hardly used. Dusty shelves held old ledgers of town bylaws, petty crime records, unremarkable case files, and a handful of lockboxes with more serious materials. Bradley had studied them extensively years ago after returning from his military deployment, but he hadn't been back in ages. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed, painting the cramped room in a sickly hue. The faint smell of mold tickled his nose. He settled the puppy on a small desk, offering it a few gentle pats as he fished his keyring from his belt. A battered filing cabinet near the rear was marked with a fatting sticker, closed or inactive cases. He inserted his key, jiggled it until the rusted lock gave. He grabbed several of the thickest folders from the bottom drawer, including the case referencing the Armitage estate fire. Then he spotted the name Baines Charlene on a file tab. His throat tightened. That was the missing nurse whose name he'd seen in the documents. He pulled it out and flipped through the handful of pages inside. The official summary of her disappearance was infuriatingly vague. Charlene Baines, Willowbend General's head night nurse, had vanished without a trace. The meager notes only stated that she was last seen leaving her shift on a Tuesday evening almost a decade ago. No forced entry was found at her home, no sign of foul play. A short statement from the hospital's administration indicated they had no knowledge of her whereabouts. The final line concluded with, "Case declared cold due to lack of evidence." That was it. No mention of her rumored involvement with any wrongdoing, no references to the hush-hush rumors swirling around the Armitage family. Yet the documents he'd taken from the Armitage mansion's basement all but screamed that she'd discovered something they wanted buried. Frustration churned in Bradley's gut. He laid out the contents of Charlene Baines's file next to the new materials he had gathered. One photograph caught his eye, Charlene, a kind-faced woman in her early 30s, wearing scrubs and a cheerful smile. On the back of the photo, someone had scribbled, "Last known photograph, Willowbend General, 8 days before disappearance." He placed the photo atop a typed note from the basement trunk that read, "She knows too much," followed by "Locate Ms. B." The alignment was far too telling. The shortness of the nurse's official file reeked of a cover-up. Somebody had truncated that investigation or never pursued it with genuine intent. Possibly someone inside the department itself. At that moment, the puppy stirred on the desk, yawning. Bradley realized just how desperately he wanted to protect this small creature, and how the puppy's existence might be the clue that unraveled all of Willowbend's hidden corruption. He lifted the puppy and let it nuzzle his shoulder while he sifted through the rest of the cases. A gentle scuffling in the hallway outside made him freeze for a second, but the noise passed by and no one entered. Feeling calmer, he continued rummaging. Another file labeled Armitage Fire contained a black and white photograph of the once grand Victorian estate. The place looked pristine in the photo, captured before flames and time turned it into a haunted ruin. The text repeated the official narrative. Faulty wiring ignited a blaze that consumed most of the structure. No survivors, no bodies recovered. Bradley compared that to what he'd witnessed last night. The mansion's scorched interior, fresh footprints in the dust, scattered evidence of dark experiments. At least one person had been there recently, and the basement suggested that the house had never fully been abandoned. Why had the official records insisted on total destruction? Shaking his head, he packed up everything: the nurse's file, the Armitage Fire file, and the new evidence from the trunk. The longer he lingered, the greater the risk someone might question what he was up to, especially if certain powerful figures in Willowbend were compromised. He needed an ally, someone he could trust unequivocally. His first instinct was to confide in his old friend and mentor, Detective Harold Gonzalez. Harold had served in Willowbend's police force for over 3 decades, known for his unwavering sense of duty. But Harold had retired 2 years earlier, citing health reasons. Bradley was sure Harold still lived on the outskirts of town, dabbling in restoring antique cars in a modest garage. If anyone could help him navigate this minefield, it was Harold. Fewer active officers meant fewer potential leaks. Slipping from the archives, Bradley made a quiet exit from the station, puppy tucked securely under his jacket. Outside, the mid-morning sun had burned off some of the gloom, though heavy clouds still hovered on the horizon, remnants of last night's storm. He drove out of town along the old highway, the puppy perched on the passenger seat, resting its chin on the window's edge. In the distance, farmland rolled out like patchwork, dotted with crooked fences and low barns. Eventually, he pulled up to a small, weather-beaten house with an attached garage. The mailbox bore peeling letters, Gonzalez. Bradley parked in the gravel driveway, scooped up the puppy, and knocked on the door. After a tense moment, the door opened, revealing Harold's stocky frame and salt-and-pepper beard. Bradley, the older man, greeted in surprise. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Sorry for barging in, mind if we talk?" Bradley asked quietly. Harold's gaze dropped to the puppy, eyebrows raised, but he simply stepped aside, letting Bradley in. The living room was cluttered with car parts and the musty smell of old newspapers. The faint hum of a radio broadcast emanated from the kitchen, something about the local harvest festival. Harold led him to a worn couch, and Bradley set the puppy down, where it immediately curled up on an old cushion. For a few moments, Bradley just breathed, collecting himself. "Better sit down," Bradley finally said to Harold, pulling out the envelope of documents. "I've stumbled onto something huge and dangerous." Harold lowered himself into an armchair, hands folded across his chest. "You've got my attention, go on." Bradley took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the previous night. From the puppy's frantic arrival to discovering the basement under the burned-out Armitage mansion, encountering the shadowy figure, and uncovering references to Nurse Charlene Baines and potential black market activities. As he spoke, Harold's expression tightened, eyes flicking between the documents and the puppy who dozed fitfully on the couch. When Bradley finished, Harold exhaled a shaky breath. I always suspected the official explanation for the Armitage fire was too neat. That whole family vanished overnight and the department was quick to file it away. Back then I poked around, but I got stonewalled at every turn. Official channels were locked tight. I suspected some of our own brass were compromised, but I never had proof. He set the papers down on the coffee table. If these documents are real and they look real, then we're dealing with something that goes beyond a simple house fire or a missing nurse. We're talking about deep-rooted corruption, possibly a trafficking ring, maybe blackmail. Bradley nodded, feeling both validated and alarmed. The question is, how do we proceed without tipping our hand to the wrong people? If the station's compromised, we could be walking into a trap by sharing this too widely. Harold gazed out the window, drumming his fingers on the arm of the chair. Well, first things first, this puppy clearly went through something. It might be a living piece of evidence. If they've done medical testing, it could have markers, chemical, genetic, something tying it to that lab in the mansion. You need a vet you can trust to confirm that. Second, we need to see if we can locate any survivors connected to the Armitages or discover if Nurse Baines truly ended up in their clutches. Bradley thought of Dr. Marie Caldwell, Willowbend's compassionate veterinarian who sometimes volunteered with local rescue groups. She kept certain animals off the official record if the owners were suspected of mistreatment. If he appealed to her good nature and asked for discretion, she might help. I think I know who to ask, he said. Harold gave him a solemn nod. Do that, then we regroup. If we can confirm that puppy was a test subject, it'll be a smoking gun. After that, maybe we see if we can pry deeper into the property deeds mentioned in these documents. If there are more places like the Armitage house, let's just say we might be dealing with an entire network of hidden labs or storerooms. The missing nurse might have uncovered something about those sites, which is why she was silenced. Bradley's stomach churned at the thought of a broader conspiracy. He bundled the files, standing up. I'll make sure to keep you updated, and thank you, this means a lot. Harold rose as well, resting a hand on Bradley's shoulder. We'll figure it out, just watch your back. Folks who do this kind of thing don't tolerate outsiders meddling. He glanced at the puppy. And keep that little one safe, too. Clutching the puppy in the envelope, Bradley left the house. Clouds gathered again, threatening more rain. He started his cruiser and headed back toward town, determined to see Dr. Caldwell immediately. It was nearing midday. Willowbend's quaint streets bustled with weekend traffic, families running errands, teens cruising around, local vendors offering fresh produce at the farmer's market. Everything looked so normal, so at odds with the sinister revelations swirling in Bradley's mind. He reached the veterinary clinic on the edge of town. It was a small brick building with a green awning and a sign reading Caldwell Veterinary Services. Inside, the waiting area smelled of antiseptics and faint pet odors. A lone receptionist looked up from behind a counter, eyes widening at the sight of a uniformed officer carrying a trembling puppy. Bradley offered a tight smile, quietly requesting an urgent consultation with Dr. Caldwell. 5 minutes later, he was ushered into a small exam room where Dr. Caldwell, a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and silvery streaks in her hair, beckoned him over. Well, hello there, she said gently, focusing first on the puppy. She ran her hands over its back, palpating for injuries, and carefully inspected its paws. Poor thing's been through the ringer. Where did you find it? Bradley hesitated, mindful of the secrecy he needed. Found it abandoned during my patrol, possibly abused. I'm worried about signs of experimentation. I'd appreciate if you could check for unusual substances in its bloodstream or any implants. And I need this off the record. Her gaze sharpened. Off the record, that's serious. He nodded. Serious is putting it mildly. Though her eyes flickered with curiosity and concern, she nodded. All right, let's see what we can do. I can run some basic tests in-house. Anything more specialized I can send to my friend at the State University lab, but it'll have to be discreet. That's exactly what I need. She gestured to the exam table and Bradley gently placed the puppy down. As Dr. Caldwell began to examine it, the puppy trembled but stayed relatively calm, as if sensing that she wanted to help. She drew a vial of blood, checked its eyes, ears, and mouth, then gently scanned its neck and spine for any foreign lumps. Bradley felt a pang of guilt at the obvious fear in the little creature's eyes. He murmured reassurances, stroking its fur while Dr. Caldwell worked. After about 15 minutes, she set aside her equipment. From a cursory look, I don't see any obvious embedded chips or devices, but I did notice some strange scarring around the puppy's shoulder, like small incision marks that healed poorly. Could be the result of an unskilled surgery or something else. The blood work will tell us more, though it may take a few hours to get preliminary results. If I see anything that indicates chemical tampering, I'll let you know immediately. Bradley let out the breath he'd been holding. Thank you, I'll pay whatever fees. She waved off his offer. We'll sort that out later. My priority is that this puppy is safe and healthy, and from the look on your face, you've got bigger things on your mind. He managed a grateful smile and handed her a slip of paper. That's my personal cell. Call me on that number day or night with anything you find. Dr. Caldwell nodded. I will, and be careful. He left the clinic with a swirl of worry and hope. If the tests confirmed unnatural chemicals or evidence of surgical tampering, he'd have irrefutable proof that someone in Willowbend was conducting illegal experiments or tests on animals. And that could be the key to blowing the entire conspiracy wide open. Bradley's next stop was the local diner, a cozy spot called Millie's, which served as a nexus for small-town gossip. He didn't intend to let rumors guide his actions, but sometimes folks talked more openly about local legends than they would at the police station. The diner was crowded, filled with lunch-goers. He took a corner booth, ordering just a coffee. From his vantage point, he observed the tables. A group of elderly residents chatted about the upcoming harvest festival. A middle-aged couple quietly discussed an out-of-state wedding they planned to attend. Everything sounded routine until Bradley caught a snippet from a booth just across the aisle. "Yes, I heard he was spotted near that old Armitage property last night," whispered a balding man in a flannel shirt, leaning in close to his companion. "Probably some teenagers messing around, but Marla swore she saw an extra set of headlights going up that road." Bradley casually turned his head, listening more intently. The other person, a wiry woman, shrugged. "Heard the same. People say the place is haunted, but if you ask me, it's only a matter of time until someone gets hurt in that death trap. The police should tear it down." Inwardly, Bradley frowned. If the rumor mill was already churning out sightings, it meant that someone might have also seen him investigating. The conspirators could well be on alert. Quickly finishing his coffee, he left some bills on the table and exited the diner. Rain clouds were gathering again, a damp wind rustling the leaves overhead. He hurried back to the station, slipping in as unobtrusively as possible. His plan was to head for his office, lock the door, and continue combing through the documents. But the moment he walked through the lobby, Sergeant Alexis Price spotted him. She was a capable officer with sharp instincts, known for her relentless follow-through on cases. Bradley couldn't help wondering if she could be trusted. "Bradley," she said, intercepting him in the hallway. "Where have you been? There's a local man in room 2 who insists on speaking to you, something about a trespasser at his farm." Bradley forced an even expression. "All right, I'll handle it, thanks." Then he added casually, "Busy morning, had to check something with a local vet." Sergeant Price's gaze dropped to the empty crook of Bradley's arm where the puppy had been, and a fleeting curiosity passed over her face. "Hope everything's okay," she said, though her tone hinted she suspected more than he was letting on. She turned and strode away. Bradley exhaled. He hadn't expected to be roped into petty crimes or random calls today, but ignoring a civilian complaint would only draw more suspicion. Room 2 was a cramped interrogation space near the back. Inside sat an older man named Bill Avery, a farmer whose property lines the outskirts of Willowbend's forest. His hands trembled around his cap, and worry lines etched his face. "Officer Daniels," Bill greeted softly, eyes darting around. "Thank you for seeing me. I didn't know who else to tell." Bradley lowered himself into the chair across from Bill. "What's going on?" Bill clenched his cap. "Night before last, I heard a commotion near my barn. Sounded like vehicles pulling up late, headlights off. When I went to check, they were gone, but I found muddy tire tracks leading right up to the barn. I'm used to the occasional trespasser, but this felt different, like they were searching for something or maybe dropping something off. Then last night there were people again, maybe the same ones. My dogs were going nuts. I called the station, but the line was busy. By the time I got my shotgun and got outside, they'd vanished." Bradley's pulse quickened. "Did you see them? Any details at all?" Bill shook his head, lowering his eyes. "No, just the tracks and something else. I found a piece of black cloth near my fence, kind of like a hood or part of a coat. Seemed like it got snagged on the wire. It had a weird symbol stitched into it. Looked like some fancy letter or a crest, I couldn't tell." A chill raced down Bradley's spine. "You still have this cloth?" Bill nodded fervently. "Yes, sir, that's why I came. It's in my truck. Didn't want to leave it at home in case they came back." "Let's get it," Bradley said quietly, standing up. "I need to see that symbol." They headed out to the station parking lot, a patch of cracked asphalt behind the squat concrete building. Bill fished a small plastic bag from his pickup and handed it over. The cloth fragment was damp, dark as midnight, and sure enough, a faded symbol was embroidered near one torn edge. Even in partial thread, Bradley recognized the swirling lines. It was the same cursed emblem from the puppy's collar. He suppressed a shudder, meeting Bill's anxious gaze. "I'll check into this. Good job bringing it here. If you see anything else unusual, call me directly. Here's my card." He jotted his personal number on the back. Bill nodded, relieved. "Thank you, officer. I don't want trouble. Just want to protect my farm, my family." "I understand," Bradley said, watching Bill drive away. Then he hurried back inside, stowing the bagged cloth in his desk drawer. He quietly locked the door behind him. Confirming the cloth symbol matched the puppy's collar only further cemented that a group connected to the Armitage secrets was roaming around Willowbend, and they were not afraid to trespass in the dead of night. He immediately called Harold, filling him in on the new development. Harold urged him to keep the cloth safe as physical evidence. "This is bigger than we thought, Bradley. They might have multiple hideouts," Harold said grimly before hanging up. Bradley's day was a blur of tension as he tried to complete his standard duties without raising suspicion. He kept an ear out for Dr. Caldwell's call, but the phone remained silent. Evening approached, the sky tinted a gunmetal gray, promising more rain. After finishing a few urgent tasks, he finally left for Harold's place to regroup. The puppy was still at the clinic, presumably undergoing further observation. Though Bradley worried about leaving it behind, he also trusted Dr. Caldwell's skill and compassion. Inside Harold's cluttered living room, a somber atmosphere settled over them as they reviewed the new evidence, including Bill Avery's cloth fragment. Harold traced the emblem's thread with a fingertip. "This is definitely connected," he muttered. "I think we need a direct approach now, no more poking around in the dark, let's confront this head-on." Bradley rubbed the back of his neck, meaning, "You and I both suspect certain higher-ups in town may be involved. We can't rely on them, but we can bring in state authorities or possibly federal agents if we have undeniable proof. The problem is we're not quite there yet. A cloth, a puppy's collar, some cryptic notes. It's convincing to us, but we need something bulletproof to blow the lid off." Bradley frowned, acknowledging Harold's point. "We need to catch them in the act or find something that implicates them beyond any doubt." Harold rummaged through the basement trunk documents that Bradley had shown him. "Remember those property deeds you mentioned? There's a list referencing old farmland, a warehouse near the rail tracks, and a couple of unoccupied residences in the outskirts. They're under shell companies, but all trace back to the same symbol. If I had to guess, they might be using multiple locations for these activities. If we can find which site is active right now, we might gather conclusive evidence." Bradley ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was about to respond when his phone buzzed. Dr. Caldwell's number flashed on the screen. He quickly answered. "Officer Daniels," she said, voice taut with urgency, "I've completed some basic tests on the puppy. There's something in its bloodstream, an experimental sedative that's not available on the regular market. It's definitely not a typical veterinary medication. This is black market stuff, possibly used in unlawful labs. I've never seen it used in standard medical settings." Bradley's heart pounded. "So it's real, confirmed." "Yes, and that's not all. The incision scars indicate the puppy may have had tissue samples removed, possibly for testing or genetic experiments. If you want the advanced breakdown, I'll have to send the blood sample out, but it's already damning evidence. This puppy was subjected to something highly illegal." His grip on the phone tightened. "That's exactly what I was afraid of. Thank you, doctor. Keep this under wraps. I'll be in touch." He ended the call and relayed the news to Harold, whose eyes hardened. "This is enough to get the state lab involved," Harold said. "And with the right push, they deploy investigators, but these criminals might bolt if they catch wind. We need to move carefully." "I propose we stake out one of the properties listed in the documents," Bradley said. "Preferably the warehouse near the tracks, as it's the most likely place for ongoing shipments or deliveries. If we see them transporting animals or any contraband, we can make a move." Harold rubbed his chin, then nodded. "Tonight we don't wait." The plan set, they split up to make preparations. Bradley slipped back into the station, rummaged quietly for night vision cameras and some older surveillance gear that might go unnoticed if the station's inventory logs were ever scrutinized by prying eyes. Then he met Harold in a deserted parking lot near an old feed store. From there, they headed out in Harold's truck, choosing the less conspicuous vehicle over a marked police cruiser. Darkness fell as they drove to the industrial sector by the rail tracks. The area was a cluster of abandoned warehouses and vacant lots, many lined with chain-link fences. The building in question was a gray, corrugated metal structure with tall loading bay doors. Rust coated the iron hinges. A faint glow seeped from a single window high up on the side. It was well past the typical workday, so any activity inside would be suspect. They parked a few blocks away, pulling into an alley that provided partial cover. Rain started drizzling again, pattering on the truck's roof. Donning dark jackets, they approached on foot. Their plan was simple: scout the perimeter, see if they could catch any sign of those shadowy figures, maybe snap photographs as evidence, then decide on the next move. Bradley's heart thrummed with anticipation as they crept along a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. In the distance, a train horn sounded. A single gate offered a way in, secured by a rusty padlock. Harold tested it quietly, and to their surprise, it wasn't locked. Bradley cast him a questioning look, then carefully opened the gate just enough for them to squeeze through. The yard around the warehouse was filled with debris: pallets, broken crates, old tires. Weeds poked through cracked concrete. They slunk along the side of the building, searching for vantage points. Toward the back, they found a narrow gap where a piece of corrugated metal had come loose. Bradley peeked inside. A single overhead light illuminated a large open floor space. Wooden crates and metal tables cluttered the interior. In the center, 4 hooded figures stood around what looked like a steel cage covered with a tarp. Their hushed voices echoed in the stillness. Although Bradley couldn't see exactly what was in the cage, he caught glimpses of movement underneath the tarp, something alive, judging by the faint, muffled sounds. His pulse hammered. He aimed a small camera through the gap, snapping photos. Harold, peering from another angle, looked grim. Suddenly, one of the hooded figures pulled back the tarp, revealing 2 dogs cowering inside the cage. They whimpered, pressed against each other, their fur matted with filth. The figures seemed to be examining them, occasionally jotting notes on a clipboard. Bradley's stomach twisted in revulsion. This was it, hard evidence of illegal animal testing or trafficking. He had photographic proof. The question now was how to intervene without letting them escape. He motioned silently to Harold, indicating they should call for backup. But Harold frowned, mouthing, "Who do we trust?" Bradley exhaled slowly. The local dispatch might route the call to compromised officers. Still, this was big enough that if they made an official request for state-level backup, it might trump local interference. Shuffling backward, Bradley whispered, "I'll call the state troopers directly." Before he could place the call, everything happened at once. The metallic clang of a shifting crate inside the warehouse caused one of the hooded figures to glance toward their vantage point. The glow of a flashlight beamed across the floor, nearly catching Bradley's reflection in the gap. He and Harold ducked, hearts pounding. Voices rose inside, more agitated now. Footsteps approached the side door with deliberate speed. They'd been spotted. "Move," Harold hissed, signaling to retreat into the shadows of the yard. They dashed behind a stack of rotting pallets just as the side door creaked open. Two figures emerged, flashlights sweeping across the fence line. Bradley crouched, phone gripped tight. He typed a quick text to a trusted contact at the state trooper office, someone he'd met during a county-wide training course, asking for immediate help at the warehouse. Then he stuffed the phone back in his pocket. A robed figure headed straight for their hiding spot, footsteps crunching on gravel. The flashlight beam bobbed ominously. Bradley's mind raced. Should they confront them, risk a shootout or chase? Harold tapped his shoulder, pointed to the truck beyond the fence, and motioned that they could circle around to regroup. It was a split-second decision. In unspoken agreement, they slipped away through the debris, heartbeats thundering in their ears. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the yard in a stark glare. Another figure joined the first, scanning the darkness. Bradley and Harold managed to reach the chain-link fence and slip through the gate. They sprinted to the truck, breath ragged. As the engine roared to life, they glimpsed the side door of the warehouse opening again, more figures stepping out, searching. But the downpour intensified, shrouding the night in heavy sheets of rain that concealed their getaway. "That was too close," Harold muttered, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Did you manage to get enough photos?" Bradley clutched the camera. "Yes, enough to show they're holding animals in cages. With the puppies' test results, it should be sufficient to push for a raid." Harold nodded, anxiety etched in every line on his face. "Let's hope the state troopers respond quickly and that word doesn't leak to the wrong people." They raced back to Harold's house. The old detective, though retired, still had an impressive array of communication tools. Within minutes, they managed a secure call to Bradley's contact in the state troopers division, an officer named April Hensley, who owed Bradley a favor from a previous joint operation. She listened as Bradley outlined the situation, his voice tight with urgency. He sent her the camera images and a summary of the puppy's vet findings. April promised to alert a task force specializing in organized crime and said they'd coordinate a swift operation, hopefully before the conspirators could relocate. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The hours crawled by in tense anticipation. They monitored police scanner frequencies, anxious for any sign that local officers had caught wind of the plan. Outside, rain hammered the roof relentlessly. Around 3 a.m., Bradley's phone chimed. April had mobilized a small team from the state troopers and arranged for a specialized animal rescue unit. They would converge on the warehouse at first light to conduct a raid. Bradley and Harold, exhausted but unwavering, prepared themselves to join in. Shortly before dawn, the rain finally subsided, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a sense of grim resolve. Bradley and Harold arrived near the warehouse in a nondescript sedan. They linked up with April and 3 state troopers in unmarked SUVs, each man and woman wearing a vest emblazoned with state police. The rescue unit, a van with the name Animal Welfare Task Force, idled nearby, the driver waiting for the signal. April, a sharp-eyed woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, greeted them. "We have a warrant," she said quietly, brandishing the documents. "Based on the evidence you provided, let's do this cleanly." Daybreak casting a pale glow over the dilapidated industrial zone, they moved in. The troopers fanned out, weapons ready, calling out commands. "State police, open up!" Bradley's heart hammered in his chest, remembering how the robed figures had prowled the yard just hours before. From within the warehouse, startled voices erupted. Some clattering noises suggested an attempt to flee or destroy evidence. Bradley and Harold moved in behind the troopers, stepping over broken crates in the loading bay. Inside, they found what they dreaded. Cages lined the far wall, a few with animals so weak they barely stirred. Tables were cluttered with syringes, vials of chemicals, and lab equipment. On the concrete floor lay scattered papers, many bearing that loathsome symbol. One hooded figure tried to bolt through a back exit, but a trooper tackled them. Another resisted, brandishing a crowbar, only to be subdued by April with efficient force. Within minutes, the place was secured, and the hooded conspirators were in handcuffs, trembling with rage or fear. Bradley hurried to the cages, helping the rescue team free the animals. 2 dogs, 1 cat, and several caged rabbits, all in distressing condition. He felt tears threaten as he saw raw wounds, fur missing in patches, evidence of vile experimentation. Yet among the heartbreak, there was a grim sense of vindication. They had finally exposed something monstrous. Harold joined him, gently lifting a shivering dog into his arms while the rescue workers prepared carriers. As the troopers began interrogating the suspects, Bradley overheard snippets. They demanded to speak to a lawyer, cursed the police for meddling, or in some twisted justification claimed to be advancing medical science. But even from those few words, it was clear they belonged to a larger network. They dropped mentions of others, of the next shipment, of protecting the cause. Bradley's stomach churned. This was bigger than just a handful of criminals in a warehouse, but it was a start. In the following hours, the troopers found ledgers referencing additional locations. Some matched the property deeds from the Armitage files. April and her team radioed for more support, determined to shut everything down. Bradley felt a surge of relief tinged with dread, realizing there might be more horrors out there, yet for the first time he wasn't alone in fighting it. When the warehouse operation concluded and dawn had fully broken, Bradley emerged into the pale morning light. Rainwater dripped from the eaves, forming puddles on the cracked asphalt. Harold stood beside him, a subdued grin flickering across his face. "We did it," he said, voice rasping with emotion. "We really did." Bradley nodded. "We couldn't have done it without the state troopers and you." He looked around, noticing the Animal Welfare Task Force van pulling away with the rescued creatures, heading to a veterinary hospital for urgent care. "Speaking of which," Harold said, "how's that puppy of yours?" "Still at Dr. Caldwell, recovering," Bradley answered. "I'll check on it next." They parted ways with April's team, promising to keep each other in the loop as the larger investigation unfolded. Word traveled fast in a small town, and by mid-morning Willowbend was abuzz with rumors of a massive police operation in the industrial district. Some locals whispered about a secret society or cult. Others speculated it was just a group of deranged criminals. The truth was more complex, a twisted combination of both, with possible connections to hush-hush circles of power. Bradley drove directly to Dr. Caldwell's clinic, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She greeted him at the door, her face brightening when she saw his uniform and the trace of exhaustion that told her he'd been up all night. "You look like you've been through a war," she said, ushering him inside. "It feels like it. How's our little friend?" Dr. Caldwell's expression softened. "Responding well to treatment. The puppy was anxious, but we've managed to stabilize its vitals. No major internal damage. I'd like to keep it for observation another day or two, but it should be fine." A weight lifted off Bradley's shoulders. He peered into the small kennel area where the puppy now rested on soft blankets, an IV drip providing fluids. When it saw him, its tail thumped weakly, eyes brightening. The sight nearly brought tears to his eyes. He opened the kennel door and reached in to stroke its fur gently, murmuring, "We've got you, you're safe now." Dr. Caldwell placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "If you need me to testify about what was done to this animal, I will, no question." He nodded, gratitude flooding through him. "Thank you, that might be needed soon." Back at the station, the atmosphere was electrified by the morning's events. Sergeant Alexis Price caught Bradley in the hall, eyes brimming with curiosity. "Heard something big went down near the tracks. State troopers swarming the place. Any idea what's happening?" Bradley weighed his words carefully, aware that each revelation risked drawing attention from any conspirators still lurking within the department. But with the evidence out in the open and arrests made, the risk of secrecy overshadowing justice was lower now. "We suspect a criminal operation involving illegal animal testing and possibly worse," he said, keeping his voice level. "The state is taking the lead. I can't say more at this stage, but it's real, Alexis, big. And it's tied to that old Armitage mansion fiasco from years ago." Her eyes widened, flickering with shock and concern. I never dreamed." She glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Bradley, if you need backup and you can trust me, I'm here. I might not be a detective, but I want to do the right thing." He studied her expression for any hint of deceit, but saw only genuine commitment. Slowly, he nodded. "I appreciate that." Late that afternoon, state investigators arrived in force at the Willowbend police station, setting up a temporary command post. April Hensley coordinated with them, and Harold was brought in as a consultant. The evidence from the warehouse raid, combined with the documents from the Armitage mansion, blew the entire conspiracy wide open. A few local officials were quietly taken in for questioning, some suspected of aiding or at least covering up the illicit activities. The deeper details would take time to unravel, but the immediate threat was neutralized. Willowbend buzzed like a shaken beehive, but for once, the light shone on the shadows. As evening approached, Bradley found himself in his office, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. On his desk lay the battered collar with the sinister symbol. He felt an immense sense of closure knowing that the group behind it had been exposed, yet questions still lingered. Why had the Armitages gotten involved in such a dark enterprise? Who else beyond Willowbend might be pulling the strings? But for now, the crisis in his hometown was at least contained. A soft knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. Harold stepped in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Heard you were burning the midnight oil," Harold said, offering 1 cup. "Thanks," Bradley murmured. "I'm trying to finalize my report for the state troopers." Harold nodded, settling into a chair. You did good, we got them. Bradley sipped the coffee. We did, couldn't have done it alone. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Outside the window, Willowbend's main street glowed under streetlights, the remnants of storm clouds drifting away. After all the darkness of the past 2 days, Bradley felt a profound sense of relief. Eventually, Harold patted the arm of the chair. I'm heading home, my wife's probably worried sick, call me if anything else happens. Bradley rose and shook Harold's hand. I will, thanks again for everything. After Harold left, Bradley looked at the collar one last time. In his mind, he saw the puppy's frightened eyes the night it ran up to him, the same collar around its neck. He remembered the fear he'd felt discovering that emblem in a forgotten basement. Now, with the group behind bars, that collar was just an artifact of a nightmare that was finally ending. He placed it in an evidence bag, sealing away the last physical token of the Armitage conspiracy. 2 days later, the sun shone bright and clear over Willowbend, as though nature itself wanted to wash away the lingering gloom. Bradley walked up the steps of Dr. Caldwell's clinic carrying a soft pet carrier. It was time for the puppy to be discharged. He arranged to foster it for the immediate future, ensuring the little dog wouldn't end up in a shelter or pass to some unknown owner. After everything the puppy had endured, Bradley felt protective. He wanted to provide a stable, caring home, one that might finally allow the puppy's wounds to heal, both physical and emotional. Dr. Caldwell met him in the waiting room. You're just in time, she said, smiling warmly. Your friend here is ready to go home. She led him to the back, where the puppy pranced excitedly at the sight of Bradley, tail wagging in little bursts of joy. Its fur had been cleaned and brushed, the eyes now bright and trusting. A small bandage remained on its foreleg where the IV had been, but otherwise it seemed well on the path to recovery. Bradley crouched down, letting the puppy sniff his outstretched hand before rubbing its ears. Hey buddy, he murmured, voice thick with emotion. You've been through a lot, huh? Dr. Caldwell handed him a folder of papers. Here's the post-op care instructions, some medication schedules. Keep me updated on any changes. I'll handle the advanced lab results. They'll likely confirm more about what they injected into it. For now, rest is crucial. Bradley nodded, lifting the puppy carefully and placing it in the open pet carrier. The puppy gave a soft, happy bark as if finally sensing safety. He turned to Dr. Caldwell. Thank you for everything, not just the medical care, but for staying quiet when we needed time to sort this out. She waved off his thanks with a smile. I'm just glad to see a good outcome for once. Too many animals end up suffering for no reason. Take good care of that little one. He promised he would. Outside, the crisp morning air greeted them. Bradley carried the puppy to his car, setting the carrier on the passenger seat. As he started the engine, he glanced at the pup through the mesh door. Let's get you home, he said softly. The puppy stared back with shining eyes. Home for now was Bradley's modest house in a quiet Willowbend neighborhood. A small white fence enclosed a patch of lawn where the puppy would soon learn to run without fear. Bradley imagined setting up a cozy corner by the fireplace and maybe a bed in his own room for those nights the puppy might still get frightened. As he pulled into his driveway, a sense of contentment warmed him. Sure, the deeper mysteries of the Armitage family and their network might not be fully unraveled, but the immediate threat had been dismantled. Innocent animals were spared further torment, and the criminals behind it were in custody. He carried the puppy into the house, letting it cautiously explore the living room, sniffing at the furniture. Sunbeams streamed through the windows, lighting up the space. Setting down the pet carrier, Bradley sat on the couch, patting his knee. The puppy hopped up, nestling close. Outside, a breeze stirred the autumn leaves, a gentle reminder of how quickly seasons and fortunes could change. In the coming days, there would be formal interviews, court dates, and more. Nurse Baines's fate might remain an unsettling question mark if they couldn't uncover her final whereabouts, but at least her name was no longer lost to a dusty file. The entire ordeal would draw new scrutiny to Willowbend's buried secrets, and for the first time in a long while, Bradley felt like their quiet town might confront its ghosts rather than hide them. The community, though shaken, would rally around the truth, ensuring no such darkness could fester unnoticed again. The puppy, yawning now, settled its head on Bradley's thigh. With a gentle smile, he scratched behind its ears. We made it, he whispered. You're safe, I promise I'll keep it that way. The puppy's tail thumped once against the couch cushion as if to say it understood. Officer Bradley Daniels closed his eyes for a moment, letting the calm wash over him. He thought back to that first moment outside the station when he'd heard a frantic whimper on a lonely street. That sound had led him down a winding path of danger and discovery, bringing him face to face with the darkest corners of Willowbend's history. Yet it had also brought him new purpose, a reaffirmation of why he'd chosen the badge. Sometimes it took the smallest cry for help, a vulnerable puppy in the rain, to expose secrets that needed to be uncovered. In the end, the conspiracy was shattered, the innocent were rescued, and those behind the cruelty faced justice. The town of Willowbend might never be exactly the same, but perhaps that was for the best. And as for the puppy, it finally had a home, a life free from fear and full of the hope and tenderness that every living creature deserved. All was still, and for that moment at least, Bradley allowed himself a peaceful smile, content in the knowledge that sometimes, no matter how dire the darkness, it only took a single light to guide the lost to safety. The puppy's contented sigh at his side reminded him that they had both found their way home.